This bracket season, FanDuel is letting you make the call. Because right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's 200 extra bucks to bet on everything from clutch shots to last-second heartbreaks, and even who's cutting down the nets. If you've been waiting to join, there's no better time. There's tourney action almost every day, and FanDuel has amazing bet types like spreads, totals, game props, and so much more. So visit FanDuel.com/betbig and get in on the college hoops action all tourney long. National. Must be 21 plus and present in select states or 18 plus and present in D.C. First online real money wager only. $5 first deposit required. Bonus issued as non-withdrawable bonus bets, which expire 7 days after receipt. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. FanDuel is offering online sports wagering in Kansas under an agreement with Kansas Star Casino, LLC. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit FanDuel.com/RG. Call 1-888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org/chat in Connecticut or visit mdgamblinghelp.org in Maryland. Hope is here. Visit gamblinghelplinema.org or call 800-327-5050 for 24/7 support in Massachusetts or call 1-877.
Hello, Toffees. Welcome back to another episode of The Blue Frontier. James here, joined by Ryan and Sean. And today, we're very pleased to introduce a new multi-part series we're trying out as Everton stare down the barrel of a massive restructuring under the Friedkin Group. In this series, we'll be analyzing the recruitment of some different Premier League clubs who have improved their fortunes in recent years. And in doing that, look for takeaways Everton might apply to move up the table in the years to come. Before we get into it, just a reminder to leave us a rating and review if you enjoy the show. Follow the show on socials, links in the description, and definitely join our Discord. It's a great community. We'd love to have you. With that, I'll hand it off to Ryan to introduce today's club.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Newcastle. They just had a big parade. They won a trophy. Do you want to talk quickly about whether they're permitted to do that or not?
The parade police out in full force at that celebration.
I don't quite understand. That's just disappointing to me that anyone would care. I think it's a great thing. Can't wait for it to be Everton. But I think there's also something to be said about how to change English football. So maybe it's going to be its own entire other series. But I think it's fair to ask, and there's some similarities, I think, between Everton and Newcastle that we'll get into in a second. But we just thought it made sense to kind of look and say, all right, well, Everton are where they are right now. By all accounts, it looks like we're going to have a big summer. Depends on what the accounts look like, which are supposed to be out tomorrow. And so we talked about Angus Kinnear coming in and some of Leeds' recruitment. Talked about that balance of being, were they too aggressive when they first went up and taking risk. I think that's an important aspect of any recruitment. It's risk. In essence, these are investments in many ways. We talked about recruitment under West Ham at Moyes, where it was short-term oriented, very much the influence of the manager. And there was a cap to that, but maybe a lower, longer-term ROI, but they got a Conference League win. So those are the types of things. So Newcastle, we thought, were probably the best team to really look at. Comparison-wise, the timing was very good because, again, parade. So the first things first, there are a lot of comparisons kind of with the takeover of the Public Investments Fund from Saudi in October of 2021 between Everton and Newcastle. Slight difference between ownership groups in terms of background, the Friedkin Group and Saudi Arabia. But yeah, I mean, I think it starts with the ownership groups, though. I mean, kind of what they were going from and what they're going to. I think there are a lot of comparisons, and I think it's kind of an interesting and a comparable situation for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you look at, of course, Mike Ashley, which, if you ask Newcastle fans, just absolutely hated the guy for a large portion of his tenure there. And then, of course, Farhad Mashiri, who folks at Everton liked when he first got there, and then absolutely just hated the guy as well, right? So in terms of satisfaction with ownership for both fan bases, I think they were at their wits' end. But then, of course, you bring in competent operators as well as, the PIF, as you pointed out, Ryan, and as we'll get to. And then I think what's really interesting, and I hate that we have this in common with them, but they both appointed Rafa Benitez. And, of course, for them, it went a little better than it did for us, but that's not really saying much, right? Because they needed new ownership to fix everything. One thing that was interesting, and we'll get into that in a little bit, is they appointed Eddie Howe in November of 2021. So that was kind of their, manager changeover to really kind of stabilize the ship. But then, in terms of their record, and I think, we can kind of get into that, they were relegated as well as constantly kind of fighting relegation for many, many years. And you kind of look, it's just funny to kind of do a little bit of revisionist history on like who their top scorers were. And, John Joe Shelby, right? Like Jose Perez, Dwight Gale, right? It's just like you have guys that I think were definitely kind of, when you look at the lower echelon of the table, those are guys who expect to kind of be in higher contributing positions. But then, kind of getting into, let's say what has happened after, I think it's a good transition.
Yeah, and I don't think too many people would complain necessarily about, if you just looked on the surface, their results. We'll get through the recruitment as to why, but I mean, just looking at them from January, ultimately 2020, we'll get into exactly the situation. It was a tough situation to deal with, but, fast forward, you look at 22-23. I mean, the next year they were in the Champions League spots. Their expected points is third, too. I mean, they definitely deserved it. League Cup runner-up, lost to United in the final. It's amazing how United have been so bad, yet managed to win a couple trophies. It's like, really? And then you look at 2023, they finished 7th, but expected points was 4th. I mean, no Europe. That's a big deal. We'll talk about that when we get into those windows. And currently they're 6th, and their expected points is lower. I mean, they're middle of the table. They're at 10th. I don't think they're as good a club maybe as they have been, good a side the last couple of years, but they won the League Cup. And they're going to be in the Conference League too, so they're at least going to get some element of Europe, and they're not far from breaking back into the Champions League. I mean, it's a tight race right in there. But I think on the surface, ignoring kind of the financial situation and exactly the player composition, from a results standpoint, I think if we looked back, 3.5 years from now, and that's what Everton looked like, I think we'd be pretty happy, no?
Absolutely. I mean, you think Newcastle, the situation they were in their sort of rapid ascent through, obviously, the new investment, the trajectory that they were put on is something I think all Everton fans would hope for. You're competing for Europe regularly. You're winning a trophy for the first time in decades for your club. The comparisons are very similar. I mean, I think the Mike Ashley, Moshiri results in terms of underinvestment were the same. How they came about that underinvestment. Ashley sort of just refused to invest in the club. Moshiri got his kind of knees chopped out from under him with Russia, but the end result's the same. And then the new owners come in, put money into the club, turn around the commercial fortunes, and the results on the pitch absolutely skyrocket. And they made a big jump very quickly. And we'll talk about how they did that and whether that's something Everton would look to do versus a more gradual approach, something we hit on a lot in the Kinnear episode last time.
Well, they are in slightly different situations we'll get into. As of right now, I think Everton's probably in slightly better footing than Newcastle was. Maybe not from a PSR standpoint because Ashley stopped spending money. So there's something to be said for that. I mean, Newcastle were able to spend a lot, and you'll see it. In fact, if you kind of look at it, so from 2022 or 21-22 season, in essence, just January too, because they only bought Willock that summer, which don't even get me started on that. $30 million for him was questionable. But from, in essence, the 21-22 season through the 23-24 season last season, so that's 3 years, Newcastle were 4th in net spend. And it's over 400 million euros in net. And what's interesting is you've got Spurs behind them at 350, and then it's like a massive drop-off to like 250. So that's a significant amount more than most of the clubs in the league at the time. And I mean, I think it was necessary, right? Some of that was fueled through Champions League money, of course, and I think we've seen the fallout a little bit of this past year in terms of having to slow down. But I think if you look at the results and look at the big spend, I think it's interesting to see how they did it, and that's kind of the idea. So we're going to go window by window. We'll look at structure as much as we can gain some insight into it. We'll look at the results of recruitment. It's easy to play what we would say in the States Monday morning quarterback and kind of look back and say what deals were good and what deals were bad. But I think there's kind of an interesting mix and flux and strategy. And I don't know. I think they're an interesting club to look at. So I think you got to start with their first significant move fundamentally in the football side was hiring Eddie Howe in November. They take over in October formally. They hire Eddie Howe. At the point when they hired him, I mean, Newcastle were tied for last. They had 5 points, 24 goals against. It was 19th. They're 19th in XG too. So similar to the Dice side, to be perfectly honest, before Everton hired Moyes, which is an interesting comparison in and of itself as well too. So I mean, that's a very good parallel. But even in December 31st, they were in 19th. So that's a little bit different. 19th in expected points too. They were not getting unlucky. So there's some similarities with Moyes, but a little bit different in the fact that we feel like Dyche wasn't getting enough out of his players. And maybe Newcastle wasn't getting enough out of some of their players, but they were a little different. They needed investment, right? I mean, that seemed fairly obvious.
Yeah. I mean, to your point, Ryan, I think that squad was really struggling in regards to talent. And I think it really was a good precursor of, I mean, of course, Eddie Howe, I think we all would say is a decent to good manager. No matter who the critics are, he did a great job at Bournemouth, all things considered. And so I think the choice was pretty sound at the time. And yeah, I think for them, they just needed, I hate this kind of moniker, but Premier League players, right? They needed more of that in the squad because they just didn't have the talent to compete.
That's important context because they had immediate needs, right? Right, James? I mean, that's the difference here. We've had the success now with Moyes, and it wasn't due to player acquisition necessarily.
No, it was due to a very intelligent manager capable of getting the best out of the current squad versus, the Howe hire is dynamically different just because of kind of the trajectory that Eddie Howe was on. You've got Moyes sort of making a return to management, a sort of parallel move in the table, whereas Eddie Howe, I assume, would have taken this job based on the ownership acquisition and the promise of an upward trajectory in Newcastle, money to spend, a place for him to sort of improve his career prospects overall. Moyes, an older guy, not quite the same, nearing the end or close to the end of his career, but still Premier League experience, looking to get someone who can get results quickly and reconfigure the squad.
And I think another thing that was very interesting is knowing they had to make investments in January, how they did it, very interesting looking at it. Does the name Nick Hammond ring a bell? We did mention it on the Angus Kinnear pod. We didn't talk about it in a lot of detail. But yes, the same Nick Hammond that went to Leeds as a consultant after they went down was brought in by Angus Kinnear, and that was literally linked to Everton this past week. So they already had a head of recruitment, Steve Nixon, who'd been there for a long time, and his staff had been there for a long time, and I have a little bit of experience in dealing with those guys, and they just had shoestring budgets. It was very mom and pops. There's nothing they could do about it. Great people, really people that wanted to do well, that had limitations. So in January 2022, they bring in Nick Hammond. He was specifically appointed to oversee the recruitment efforts, and Steve Nixon ultimately, as head of recruitment, and his staff worked under him. So, interesting, right? Because in the interim, what are you going to do? And there's some similarities there because Everton, I mean, Angus isn't going to be hired for a while. You could bring a consultant on pretty quickly, and, he might be available, and so that makes sense. So maybe let's talk a little bit about Nick Hammond just because he's of interest to Everton. I kind of like some of his, I mean, people don't realize he was at Reading. Like, he was their first director of football. That was fairly new, especially in England in 2022. He's a former keeper. I think he admittedly was nothing amazing, but they won the championship in 2006, 106 points, by the way. And then the next year they finished 8th in the Premier League. I mean, that is really impressive. But one thing I do like about him, and we talked about concerns maybe with a manager having a lot of influence in a window like David Moyes had presumably in January and may have going forward, balancing out the natural short-term inclinations of a manager. Phil Hay of The Athletic kind of does this article in an interview with Brian McDermott, who's a former Reading manager. He's a now director of football at Hibs. What do we think about some of the ways that he described him in this quote? There are a couple different quotes from him, but I took one out. I mean, to me, this sounds very good.
Yeah, there's a couple, I think, very illuminating quotes here from McDermott. He deals in facts and gets things done. He's an incredibly clear thinker and isn't driven by emotion. I was the emotional one of the two of us at Reading. He never got distracted from the process. So very process-focused, detailed, seems pretty measured. Things that you would want in a proposed, whatever his involvement is, transfer committee, whatever, someone to provide clear thinking and not driven by emotion.
Yeah, and by all accounts, he just doesn't. He's not a wheeler and dealer type that wants to mess with people, and I think he's fairly well liked and has connections as a result. That being said, I think there's some debate on how much influence he had in the window. Like, they brought him in to review plans for sure. I think he made sure that those things looked good. Let's not forget, too, Willock had nothing to do with those guys. So that was a different group. That was in the summer, so that wasn't them. And so this transfer committee got stood up. Sounds familiar again. So I think there's some debate on how much influence he had in it. But I think it's worth talking through what that committee looked like and whether the circumstances merited that type of approach or not.
Yeah, and if you go into the committee, it was a 4-person panel, right? It's, of course, Eddie Howe, his assistant Jason Tyndall, which he just cracks me up. If you look at the end of any Newcastle game, he is always the first one to shake the manager's hand. So it's just like he is always the one that's in the cameras and whatnot. But he's been with Eddie Howe a long time. Director and co-owner, of course, Amanda Stavely. And then, of course, as Ryan spoke, Chief Scout Steve Nixon. So when you kind of look at that 4-person committee, it almost looks like a 50-50, if not bigger committee when you think of Eddie and Jason Tyndall, because they're probably going to be attached to the hip in regards to what their opinions are, right? And for them, of course, they have to focus on the present, and that was staying in the Premier League at the time, right? Because that's, this all sounds great, but if they get relegated, right, it's a massive, massive blow to them just on all fronts, right? And so, yeah, the strategy for recruitment was really, really interesting. Of course, we don't really know behind the scenes how much Hammond was involved. But yeah, you look, and we can get into it just because we've kind of really talked a lot about it. December was massive. January was massive, really. You look at what they did. I mean, I just remember even that photo with the 5 players. It was a big spend, more than you'd expect in any January. 3 older players, Dan Burn, Chris Wood, Kieran Trippier for big fees. Trippier, of course, the 12 million, we'll get into that in regards to big fee, but he's 31, right? So he's on the north side of 30. And then I think the biggest one, right, which I think was seen as a coup across world football, was Bruno Guimaraes from Lyon for over 40 million. And then, of course, Matt Targett, which was a loan and obligation to buy for 17.5 million. And then Eddie Howe reportedly wanted, Eddie Nketiah, Jesse Lingard, right, keeping it in the English family, but I think guys that could probably produce, right? So what are your guys' thoughts on this? I think just an aggressive window, especially for their first one going in.
Aggressive, very heavily focused for the most part on players with Premier League experience outside of obviously Bruno, and some big fees. But I think a lot of that's a byproduct of their circumstance and the fact that it's January. You're always going to have to pay a bit of an inflated fee in January for the most part, and they needed help immediately. They could not afford to do a lot of long-term thinking. How will this impact us down the line? The focus was survival, and I think viewed through that lens, it obviously paid off for them. It worked out quite well for those short-term aims.
I mean, you can't really argue they had the 4th best record in the league from January on. I think if you look at these deals in isolation, some of them don't look great. I mean, but if you're in a team that's not very good, I mean, anyone you pick up that's a decent player is going to be an upgrade. And to your point, Sean, you hate to say this, but I mean, there were some players that probably weren't Premier League caliber. So like Trippier, for example, that's the 2nd highest fee of all time for an over 30 right back. Now, again, he's stud on set pieces. You get a little bit more than you would be in your typical right back in this situation. And I mean, they had length. They bought length as well when you bring in Wood as well as Dan Burn. So maybe some of that made sense. And a couple set piece goals, if you're at the bottom of the table, can make a massive difference. We've seen that. It can change the story. So, Chris Wood, I mean, this is pretty crazy. At the time was the 3rd highest fee for a 30-year-old center forward behind Cristiano Ronaldo and Batistuta. I mean, those are, when I think of Batistuta, Batigol, and I think of CR7, I think of Chris Wood. Although, ironically, I must say this, Chris Wood has had a heck of a career. Like, think about it. He scored for fun in Burnley under Dyche. He's been a monster for Forest. And, we'll get into kind of the results of that. But it's an overpay for a guy that age, but that's what they needed. And, I mean, he scored. So, I don't know. I mean, you knew this was going to catch up to you maybe a little bit on the back end, but Guimaraes' deal is great. I just, for me, it's hard to judge them too harshly in this type of situation, right? So I think it's fine. But in the future, you'd rather get Bruno Guimaraes coming out of Pertenece. Like, you don't have to wait for him to get to Lyon. But this is an important lesson. If you're in a club that has to acquire players in a window, like you have discrete needs that you have to address, like you don't address them, you're totally hosed. It's a bad situation to be in.
One thing just on the Chris Wood piece that I think we forget to mention, he was at Burnley, right? Burnley was kind of in that relegation fight at the time. They activated the release clause, which kind of increased the cost of that, right? And yeah, I don't think Burnley wanted to lose him per se at the time that they did. So for them, I think it was just addition by subtraction, trying to reduce kind of another opponent and take advantage of the situation. So I can understand why they would spend that. I think Dan Burn at the time was pretty good money for what they got him for. And of course, as you see now, he's been a pretty great player for them. Really, the only one that I think in hindsight you play Monday morning quarterback, and I think it was probably the worst deal of them all, was Matt Target. But it's just, you're going to make tough deals. You make 5 of them, right? You're not. It's a tough expectation, right, to hit on all 5, especially in January.
Yeah, that one's weird. People forget. I mean, they brought him in on loan. They had the obligation for 17 points.
This bracket season, FanDuel is letting you make the call. Because right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's 200 extra bucks to bet on everything from clutch shots to last-second heartbreaks, and even who's cutting down the nets. If you've been waiting to join, there's no better time. There's tourney action almost every day, and FanDuel has amazing bet types like spreads, totals, game props, and so much more. So visit FanDuel.com/betbig and get in on the college hoops action all tourney long. National. Must be 21 plus and present in select states or 18 plus and present in D.C. First online real money wager only. $5 first deposit required. Bonus issued as non-withdrawable bonus bets, which expire 7 days after receipt. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. FanDuel is offering online sports wagering in Kansas under an agreement with Kansas Star Casino, LLC. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit fanduel.com/RG. Call 1-888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org/chat in Connecticut or visit mdgamblinghelp.org in Maryland. Hope is here. Visit gamblinghelplinema.org or call 800-327-5050 for 24/7 support in Massachusetts or call 1-877-5
million euros next summer. And that's not nothing, I think the only other worst deal they could have made is if Jesse Lingard came in.
Yeah, I mean, that goes to show you why you don't always want to have someone to balance out the manager influence, because that probably wouldn't have gone so hot for them. But again, as we said, you hit on basically 4 of the 5 guys in regard to the short-term need. You get comfortably safe. You have an amazing record the remainder of the year. Have to say that worked out pretty well in the short term. But that said, they did bring in Dan Ashworth in February of that year. He couldn't take the position until the end of May, but they also had some other structural changes. They brought in Andy Howe, Eddie's nephew, a little nepotism potentially there, but he was a pretty qualified guy to be the head of the technical scouting. And then Nixon stayed on as the head of recruitment. They also brought in Darren Eales as CEO in that summer and started in September from Atlanta United, a guy that Arthur Blank really liked. So similar in some ways to Everton, a massive restructuring, a lot of new faces, and perhaps looking to rethink sort of the strategy. Hey, we got safe this season. Now we need to actually build something cohesive going forward.
That's right. I think that's the pivot, right? We're like, okay, we're safe. We've got the foundation. Now we need to focus a little bit more on the future. And it just changes your approach to investment, I think, at that point. But I love it because it's like Darren Eales was known as like a big commercial revenue guy. He created what they created at Atlanta United was pretty special. I mean, just from an environment standpoint, everything packed, just the vibe and everything. And I think if you look at, you can't spend unless you drive revenue growth. And I think Newcastle took investment and began to do that. Now, they already had the stadium. Everton have a new one, obviously, but the capacity's similar and the opportunities are there too. So that's what's key. Like, the investment doesn't happen without the revenue growth as well. And they clearly made a decision to do that.
I also just think bringing in Dan Ashworth at the time, everyone, just a really smart move, really
best in class at the time, right?
Yes, 100%. Like the perfect director that you want if you're trying to emulate. Obviously he came from Brighton, done an incredible job there. I remember feeling sick to my stomach when they hired him, because knowing that Newcastle would have this commercial growth. They'd have this revenue available, and someone as shrewd as Dan Ashworth pulling the strings, it felt like kind of inevitable that they would continue to move up.
So I think a really important point is this, like, just because you have money does not mean you can get the talent that you want to get. You don't have the reputation. You don't have European football at this point. People have got to believe in your project, and players that have an option to go to top clubs wouldn't necessarily pick Newcastle. No offense. I think Everton's in a very similar situation, even though maybe Everton have, I don't know, probably a comparable reputation in terms of recognition, but certainly have much better tradition than Newcastle for sure. But I think, okay, so if you can't do that, how can I get the most bang for my buck with my money? Well, you can be aggressive and go get the best executive you possibly can. And I think people thought Dan Ashworth was best in class at that point. But it's funny, too, because then when you think about some of the players they were trying to target and try to convince, they couldn't necessarily do it. And I think that's reasonable because if you look at their kind of where they were, I mean, they were relegated many years below. So, and just were constantly battling. Hopefully people don't feel the same way about Everton. I mean, Everton can point to a couple years ago, the blip with Carlo, and if you can attract a manager like that, we'll see. And there are different ways to do that. I mean, sometimes you just have to pay money, and work through agents and things like that. But anyway, let's jump forward to the summer in 2022. You figured, okay, this is going to be a big one, little different optic, little different approach. And you kind of look at some of their approaches, I think, up front. So they tried to go after a couple different players. Ekitike is one who's now killing it at Frankfurt. We were linked to him as well. I don't think he's necessarily a perfect lead the line number 9, but incredibly talented and on the radar of everyone. He rejected Newcastle. They couldn't get the Anthony Gordon deal done with Everton. Everton asked for way too much money and eventually got that money. Couldn't get James Maddison over the line. Watford said no to João Pedro. They like Dominic Calvert-Lewin too. Remember that one. But I think the big move here is that they got their number one choice, a striker, and that's in Alexander Isak. And I think we're going to see a theme here where they did pay top dollar for some players, but most of these players they paid top dollar for up front, Guimaraes in the previous window, have turned out to be top players, and it just makes all the difference in the world. It's funny, we always think about Isak, you've got the obligation for target, but now you've got Nick Pope for 11 million, who's older, 30, but they need a proven keeper. Sven Botman's an interesting too. Isak's 22, Botman's 22. Botman was for 37 million. I think we might hear comparable feedback to him as a player, but we haven't because he's been injured so much, But I think looking at this window, they spent 185 million euros in gross. Minimal sales. They pawn off a couple players in January, eventually Chris Wood, which is interesting. We'll talk about that in a second. It's a very different window, first and foremost, right? But I'm curious your guys' thoughts on this one. Certainly a little bit of a different focus.
Yeah, for me, I thought they absolutely nailed this window. I think to your point, Ryan, it was almost like, I think Isak at the time too was like the perfect buy because he was still a very good striker, very young striker. I think kind of one of the next ups, and for Newcastle, they probably were able to sell him on that, right? That we're kind of the sleeping giant about to come. I thought Botman was a good deal. Even just the injuries, right? You can't predict that, and those things happen. I think what's kind of been the rationale for that is much like Mickey Van de Ven at Tottenham. It's just the run of games. They just need to find a better way to handle them. But then,
the risk reward, though, Sean, like these are they're expensive players and they're young players, but they're already good players too. So, you have to bring in guys that can contribute. So you're going to pay for more for a young player that's already somewhat established, but you also still have some ceiling. And I think that's kind of what they did, right?
Yeah, and also too, the reason you want to buy, I think, those type of players is, and we'll get to it, but like the Elliot Andersons of the world, the Lewis Mileys of the world, you can, you don't have to give them bigger roles than they need at the time, right? They can develop and end up being those players that over time, right, you'll be able to sell if you needed to, and of course we'll get to that. I'm not going to steal the thunder, but I thought Nick Pope actually was a very good buy, considering, when we look at how much clubs pay for keepers nowadays, right? It's kind of insane when you think of like the Andre Onana, and we'll continue to bring that up just because of how ghastly of a buy that is. He's a limited keeper, but for 11 million, he's steady, right? And so I think you look at that window and if you're a Newcastle fan, you feel very good about going into. I don't think they would have expected Champions League right off the bat, but they definitely had the squad, right, that is talented enough to do well in the Premier League.
And then I like a little bit what they did in January too. I mean, I think they overpaid for Gordon, but thank you. Everton appreciates that.
You.
But still, the point is you're dealing with a 21-year-old kid that clearly had serious potential. And it wasn't insane to think that he couldn't live up to, 45 million euros. I mean, it seems to me that, and we've talked about him on the previous pod, and I think his limitations they're there, but at this point, it was just a matter of him getting his head up, getting used to the flow of the Premier League, and just gradually improving. When you've got a right foot like he does, you had the pace, you had the length. He had a lot of things in place for him that could make him very, very successful. I mean, maybe he's not quite Cole Palmer, but you could see a little bit of that. So it's an aggressive fee. Everton didn't have to sell, but I get it. I get it. And I like, Harrison Ashby, I don't know too much about, but that's a nice youth investment right there. But to your point about Nick Pope, it's okay to invest in experience, especially if you're kind of in flux, for the reasons you said. You allow other people to develop, allow them to be eased in. You're not forced to throw people in and use them when you don't have to. But I think the key is value. You can buy for growth, but value is key. I still think there's some big fees here, though. I mean, we cannot deny that paying 70 million euros for Isak is still a big number. Paying 45 million euros for Anthony Gordon that's a big, big number. But again, this is a team that almost got relegated the year before, at least was in trouble, so I get it. However, it is very hard to argue the payoff wasn't worth it. I think it's very interesting. Rejected bid for Jack Harrison. They pushed for loans for Pulisic and Conor Gallagher, which wasn't going to happen, but okay, you shoot your shot, right? Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is it's very easy to justify the outlay here when you look at the fact that they finished fourth and made the Champions League, right? I mean, it's just massive. And I think if you look at the fees they paid for kind of their big four purchases there, I mean, look at the current market value, guys. I mean, this has worked out pretty well.
One thing I just want to also say, and it kind of goes into the Moyes Howe comparison, but, of course, finding a role for Joe Linton, right? And just using him to, instead of a striker, right? Using him as kind of the dynamic midfielder, what he's turned into. There are kind of a few other examples where he's been able to kind of, Fabian Schär is another one, right? Where he was kind of just, a middling defender. And now all of a sudden he's just been kind of their first 11, even when guys are healthy. And he's just been great in regards to both the defense and attack. So I think he's done a good job of looking at the squad, right? Of course, not making excuses on certain places and trying to figure out what he could do in the interim. And then, of course, to your point, Ryan, right? Filling needs that they really want to especially grow the squad. But then also, being able to just kind of plug and play. They have to spend big, right, in this market, right, to get the players that they want, just because they have to sell themselves as well.
But I think there's one thing to spend big on younger players at the time, because you could argue they're overpriced. But, using transfer market, which is, about as gold a standard as you're going to get. It's not perfect. We know it's not. I mean, if you look at the Guimaraes, Isak, Botman, Gordon, that's 195 million euros in fees. The current market value of those players, 290 million. And think about Botman's injuries probably hurt him. I would think he would be even higher if you think about it. So maybe a lesson to be learned here is, look, if you're going to buy young, especially early, knowing you're going to have these players for a while, and we can't ignore the fact they're on big wages, because that's going to hamper your ability to move people in theory. Get your number one guys. Especially if you're in Everton's case, don't get me wrong, I'd like to be better sooner, but if you can't get the guy that you're really sold on, don't spend that kind of money. Now, I'll say this too, a little bit underrated here. If you look at kind of the 5 players that you took up to this point that were 25, 22, 22, 21, 21, the younger growth investments in theory, you have a 47% return on investment on those guys. I mean, that is doing the business. How impressive, though, you buy Isak, and then you buy down his price by what? You send Wood on loan in January for a big loan fee, and then you lock him into an obligation to buy in the summer for 21.5 million euros. You recoup almost your entire investment on him, probably made a positive from a PSR standpoint. I mean, that's pretty, people forget about the selling. The selling matters too. And they're trying to whittle down wages, I think, at this point too. But look, now the results of this, unfortunately, is that they did finish in Europe. We looked at it. The expected points were very high. They were a very good team. They were somewhat unlucky. It's probably not ideal to have that big a net spend and finish 8th in the Premier League. But still, these players are now contributing today, and I think that's the point. You take a little bit longer-term viewpoint. You know they're going to be there contributing for a while. I think when we move into this next window, I think this is where maybe they get over their skis a little bit, to use a solid Colorado reference there for you, Sean. Okay. There are a couple PSR sales in here. We talked about the Chris Wood. We're moving into the 2023, the summer window. They finally sell St. Maximin. It's kind of like their guy, Mr. Entertainment. At his age, that makes sense. They get a decent 27 million euros for him. Okay. They don't do, I mean, they do some serious business again. I'm curious what your thoughts are on some of these guys. So again, this is a continuation, I think, of the previous strategy. You've brought in some younger guys. I still feel like they paid some significant fees in here, maybe a little too much, but not too dissimilar from a strategic standpoint.
Yeah, you're still paying, I think, slightly inflated fees for younger guys, but having just seen the windows that they pulled off in the ROI.
And you got no Europe. No Europe. So
there is a risk in sort of spending those huge fees, but if you look at how successful they were previously with the same strategy, it's sort of a continuation of that, but their luck might have run out a little bit. I mean, Tonali for 59 million euros. We know that's had some complications with that deal. Harvey Barnes from Leicester for 44 million. I think that was a huge fee, but again, you're talking about he's had his injury problems, and Leicester were probably a little difficult to negotiate with. Very good player. I mean, again, these are at face value, irrespective of fees. You think it's good recruitment, but then the fee, like Livramento, for almost 40 million euros coming off an ACL injury, seemed like a really risky move. We know he was a really highly rated prospect. We know Everton were very close to bringing him in, and I was really excited about that. But then he had the knee injury, and you're like, okay, you'd think that would hurt his value, and yet Southampton get almost 40 million for him, so good business on their part. And then, of course, they bring in Lewis Hall on a loan, and this is with the same window they bring in Minta. So still younger players, still a big fee, but similar potential for ROI, I think, at the time.
They commit to a big fee, too, in Lewis Hall the next summer, too. I think that's worth mentioning. I just think some of these fees are a little too high, too aggressive. Again, you don't have Europe, so you don't have that selling point. You're also recruiting almost exclusively from, Milan, 2 English clubs. I like the Minta buy. I mean, that's turned out well. I mean, that one's easy to look back on, but that's like the only buy that they made outside of top 5 leagues.
Well, I think what's interesting too, Ryan, is I'm kind of surprised that the relegated clubs had as much ability to, almost kind of command those fees, right? Because we talk about, of course, when you get relegated, market values for the players, you can't demand as much, right? Because in many cases they're wanting to leave, right? And so, yeah, Leicester was able to get a great fee for James Maddison, a great fee for Harvey Barnes, right? Even Castagne. So it's and Livramento, to your point, James, it's like I don't know how they were able to get a fee like that for a player that basically did not play almost that entire season for Southampton. So credit to the clubs that did get relegated and got that money. To your point, Ryan, I think it was a little bit of the I give them credit the last window, but I don't think I give them as much credit on this window. Take the Tonali, kind of year ban away. I think they, spent a little bit more on this one where on those fees, I question them a little bit more.
But Harvey Barnes for a slightly smaller fee than Anthony Gordon, I mean, I guess it's
it doesn't look relatively that bad, right?
He was a better player at the time than Gordon was,
Agreed.
for sure. Maybe not as high as maybe not quite as high a ceiling, but similar age. And I mean, Barnes was way better for Leicester than Gordon was for Everton. So I would say that the Barnes deal better than the Gordon deal for sure. You're still splashing almost 50 million for a young player. So it's...
Yeah, and I think it's, after we kind of get through the last one, we could go back, take a little bit more of a deeper dive to see the options and alternatives, because the lesson to be learned here is like you're starting to now over time see that they're getting young talents, but that's a lot of money. I have some problems with Tonali as a player too, just in general, because phenomenally talented, great on the ball, very interesting, but makes crazy decisions, very risky, very dynamic player though, like massive ceiling, but also has a bit of a floor. And I'm fine with taking risk. Like, I don't think that's a bad thing, but I just think I think there are other guys you could have taken a risk on that would have been more cost effective. And I wonder if this is the recruitment strategy is maybe a little limited. And so I think it's worth making the transition. So in February 2024, Dan Ashworth leaves. United pay a ton for him. That's one thing that doesn't show up here in recruitment. They got a big fee for him, like $20 million or whatever, just to get rid of him, which is interesting.
United just loves paying big fees, Ryan. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, right? So,
well, I mean, if we really want to have fun with recruitment, we should really do United. You know what I mean? That would be a fun
no lessons
one,
to be learned. Zero lessons to.
Well, because, I mean, it goes to show you, it's like the Isak deal or whatnot. You know, like you really need a player in that position. So do you go and pay the extra money? I don't know. For a guy like Jared Branthwaite, or do you go get...
No, just pay $80 million for Rasmus Højlund. It's simple, right? Like, yeah, that'll fix it. So, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's the funny part. I mean, people are overpaying all the time. It's just, do you get someone good for it? So I think it was really interesting. So they bring in Paul Mitchell, to improve the hairstyling products and offerings at the club, and also to be their sporting director in July 2024. I'm not going to lie. I've wanted for so long to make a joke about Paul Mitchell. Paul Mitchell's a guy that I actually quite like. I mean, he's kind of an anomaly in English football, and the fact that he went to Monaco to be sporting director, and he has some really interesting relationships as well. He's been all over, incredibly experienced. Just beat out Johannes Spors from 777, the collective sporting directing genius.
R.I.P. 777.
You know, it's so sad, too. I think Johannes, by most accounts, is a pretty good guy and a good football guy, too. So,
well, I remember at the time when when that was on the table for 777, that was one of the things we took as a positive. Was like, well, at least they have this guy. There's a lot of questions, but at least they have a seemingly competent guy pulling the strings.
Yeah, and I mean there were some discussions between recruitment teams, and I think they were optimistic about the people working at 7-7, at least on the football side. So credit to them for that. Outside of their villainy,
maybe not the most discerning of character.
Well, there's something to be said for who you work for. But that being said, I'd probably be the worst example of that. So moving on from that, so it was very interesting to hear what Paul Mitchell said about moving to Newcastle initially. And then looking at the window and seeing what he said after, fairly different, right? Talked about the growth and ambition of the club, the amazing fan base. Can't wait to get started and help continue the organization's growth and long-term competitiveness in all areas of elite football performance. And again, he's inheriting a good team, for sure. But I think he was probably a little bit surprised at some of the limitations in the marketplace. But it's a very interesting and very different window for Newcastle.
This bracket season, FanDuel is letting you make the call. Because right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 extra bucks to bet on everything from clutch shots to last-second heartbreaks, and even who's cutting down the nets. If you've been waiting to join, there's no better time. There's tourney action almost every day, and FanDuel has amazing bet types like spreads, totals, game props, and so much more. So visit FanDuel.com/betbig and get in on the college hoops action all tourney long. National. Must be 21 plus and present in select states or 18 plus and present in D.C. First online real money wager only. $5 first deposit required. Bonus issued as non-withdrawable bonus bets, which expire 7 days after receipt. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. FanDuel is offering online sports wagering in Kansas under an agreement with Kansas Star Casino, LLC. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit FanDuel.com/RG. Call 1-888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org/chat in Connecticut or visit mdgamblinghelp.org in Maryland. Hope is here. Visit gamblinghelplinema.org or call 800-327-5050 for 24/7 support in Massachusetts or call 1-877.
It's true that some things change as we get older. But if you're a woman over 40 and you're dealing with insomnia, brain fog, moodiness, and weight gain, you don't have to accept it as just another part of aging. And with MIDI Health, you can get help and stop pushing through it alone. The experts at MIDI understand that all these symptoms can be connected to the hormonal changes that happen around menopause, and MIDI can help you feel more like yourself again. Many healthcare providers aren't trained to treat or even recognize menopause symptoms. MIDI clinicians are menopause experts. They're dedicated to providing safe, effective, FDA-approved solutions for dozens of hormonal symptoms, not just hot flashes. Most importantly, they're covered by insurance. 91% of MIDI patients get relief from symptoms within just 2 months. You deserve to feel great. Book your virtual visit today at joinmidi.com. That's joinmidi.com.
Yeah, I think you go into this window Ryan, and to your point, right? They're coming off of the non-Europe. They are, in many cases, I think for his standpoints, and of course we'll get into it, just strapped. And for them, I think this is where, unfortunately, they had to really make some not bad, but tough decisions in selling Elliot Anderson, right? And that's kind of the PSR deal where they get the backup keeper for, 20 plus million, right? So it's just, that, of course, similar to...
That was a football deal, Sean. That's not a PSR deal. That's what they said.
It's like the Dobbin and Tim deal, right? It's just, it's good business for both. And so you look at Lewis Hall, right? That converts to a sale for $33 million. William Osula. My favorite part of this window is if you really wanted to kind of like go back on the kind of the timeline. I mean, look at some of these names. John Ruddy, right? He always finds himself on some club, free transfer from, it's like the Scott Carson situation. And then Isaac Hayden, remember him, basically kind of, end of loan. Jamal Lewis, who they paid $15 million or $15 million for, just kind of one of their tough, transfers during the Mike Ashley era. He kind of is end of loan. Loris Karius, remember him? I mean, it's just like there are some guys when you Matt Ritchie, Ryan Frazier. I mean, we go on and on.
What a character!
I know. It is funny. But then to your point, Ryan, I think Minte ends up getting sold right the window after for $35 million. So it ends up being a really kind of good bit of business for them. Of course, there were rumors about DCL. Potentially going to Newcastle, that never materialized. I think one deal that, when we talk about Everton, which could really be a place of good fortune, is they say they did sign Lloyd Kelly on a free, which ended up being a very lucrative deal for them because even though they signed him on big wages, they did end up selling him in the January window for $17.5 million, right? So that's just kind of, almost free money, from a player that they essentially signed as a free agent, right? So it's looking at those kind of opportunities on the free market and where you can, potentially get some good funds on that.
Yeah, it's value. That's value. That's that, and that is a good deal. And yeah, they're strapped here, man. I mean, look, this is their first, positive net spend. I hate to use the kind of backwards terminology on that one. But what I thought was very interesting, and I think that's what's really worth us going through because it kind of shows you the shift in strategy, is all the things Paul Mitchell had to say after the window. The one big failure that was viewed as a failure, I guess, at the time is the fact that they couldn't get Gahey over the line from Palace. And apparently Newcastle walked away from a £70 million deal. Eddie Howe was frustrated. And so Mitchell does this interview with Craig Hope from the Daily Mail. I'll give him credit for the interview. And man, some of these quotes are just, he says the transfer strategy he walked into at Newcastle was not fit for purpose. And he promised to stamp his influence on the club after playing only a supporting role this summer. And he talks about being, we avoid breaching PSR by the skin of their teeth in June, paying the price for overspending, failing to sell players, depth and breadth of scouting knowledge that he believes is too small. Some of these things are true, but man, some of the quotes he goes into, his direct quotes in here, I think are really, really telling and very interesting and worth exploring.
Definitely. And so first of the quotes is he went on to say, I think it's difficult coming into a predefined strategy. Should our scouting and recruitment be driven more extensively with a wider reaching net? It definitely should, because this is becoming a really nuanced space now when you can't just capitally fund everything every year and buy loads of players at peak age and peak price. Of course, it needs to be, and that's the responsibility of me, the scouting team, and Eddie. So talking about driving consensus across the different departments in the football organization, talking about looking back at those windows. A lot of recruitment almost exclusively in England, ventured out a little bit, but still pretty much top 5 leagues, and buying players at or near the peak of their value. So in his view, obviously not something that was sustainable. And I think this is, as we talked about, the window in which it demonstrates why that's not sustainable, because they're right up against PSR. When you aren't making Europe every single year, you run into these financial constraints and the bricks that you laid before kind of start to collapse.
And a couple things too, we didn't have the sales window we thought we would have, as he said. Well, yeah, you didn't have many assets to sell, unfortunately. And some of the ones that you did buy, you bought them at top dollar. So that's why the Chris Wood stuff and things like that are so dramatic and impressive and useful. And then, I like this one. He doesn't mention Gay by name, but his comment was about Eddie Howe, We had a player as the key core target, he said. We were still in dialogue with Palace all the way through. That's obvious who he's referring to, I guess. But Eddie was very clear, and it's not up to me after 7 weeks to say we'll do this and that because I'm in a supporting role. Eddie Howe had always been given final approval over transfer deals this entire time, and I think that's really important. So up front, when you want the guys to come in immediately, that's fine. That made sense to having heavy coaching influence on the committee. But even in the circumstance I think that Everton are in now, you got to consider those things, because if you're going to compromise for risk and reward, you're going to compromise from a reward standpoint. So you got to be careful about these things. But let's pick about some of these things. So James, the one thing that you mentioned, the wider reaching net. So in reference to the immediate window there was no one outside of England bought that past summer, right? Now, the previous summer, 3 of the 5 were from England. Plus, we had 1 from AC Milan. Minte was the only one from outside of a big league, and he came from Denmark. And that's the only one they bought at all from outside of even. And the next 2 years are 4 or 6 from England, 1 from Spain, 1 from France. The year before that, 3 or 5 from England, 1 from France, 1 from Spain. I mean, other than saving yourself a lot of money on scouting fees, which don't really cost that much. Trust me, I know scouts are not highly paid. But I think he's got a point here on the wider reaching net, right? I mean, I don't see a lot of these investments of like look at someone like Guimaraes as a good example. Perenese, Lyon paid a lot of money for him to go there, but not that much money. And you look and they turn it around and made a massive profit. And those leagues are good. Like if you're good in Brazil, it's not the worst league in the world to buy from to bring someone over to England. So I mean, I think he's got a point here in wider reaching net, doesn't he?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, Ryan, and you look at the buys that they have had outside of England, I think they've all been pretty successful, right? So it's just, you kind of go into, of course, the top 5 leagues, but even extending outside of that, I think he's pretty spot on. And of course, he's an incredibly experienced guy. I think he has been pretty spot on what he's seen at Newcastle and what needs to improve, in terms of his judgment. He talks about let's look at us in 5 years to see if we've really, done anything. So yeah, I would 100% agree. And to your point, it's just, they can't continue to just put significant capital right on these players and then, be in the situation once again where they have to sell the Elliot Andersons of the world and the Kuba Mintes of the world. Because yeah, they're hurting themselves at the end of the day.
And I think probably in the short term, they didn't quite realize the ramifications of that. They thought, well, let's just buy players who are ready now, immediately can plug in and play, and weren't necessarily taking that long-term view that Paul Mitchell was happy to provide as he came in. And Ashworth, there's no reason Ashworth wouldn't have had that perspective too, but, whether there was alignment on we need to think about that 5-year time horizon versus the 1 to 2 year, we need Champions League every year to maintain revenue. So I think that partially explains, but Mitchell certainly a different approach from his predecessor.
I think some of the challenges too, you're buying players that you want to plug and play right away still. So his comment about loads of players at peak age and peak price. I'm not so sure about the peak age thing. So let's unpack that a little bit. I mean, the first window, of course, right? But the windows after that, the average age for non-keepers was under 22 years old. That's not peak age, man. I mean, that's lower than peak age. So I don't think that's a fair criticism to say that you're not buying younger players. Now that being said, they're not making a lot of investments in kind of that young developmental type player where you're buying them with the intent that they're either going to grow in performance and then you can move someone else on, or you can sell them on for the Minte deal. There aren't many of these. The Anderson one's hard to look at too because it's so messed up from a PSR standpoint. But peak price, I mean, yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, I think we know the wages are high anyway to get those guys over here, but I think Isak, Gordon, Botman, I mean, these are peak price, but those guys have grown, I think, in value. You could sell them if you wanted to, and that's okay. So maybe the risk is a little bit broken up. But some of these other guys, I mean, you can't get every one of these guys right in buying that way, even if it's for unforeseen circumstances. So for example, like Tonali. I mean, he didn't come in and play constantly right away. He was capable of doing that, sure. He was on big wages. And I get it. There was that massive run on U23 center mids in that period, like Bellingham, Caicedo, Soboslai, Lavia, Ugarte. Those guys were all big money. But I mean, Tonali, they almost paid 60 million euros for him. Was he worth that? There's some comps here that I think are. Would you have had him at that time more than Gravenberch for 40 million? Kokyu, I think, is a really talented guy for $25 million. Like that, I think that's a better fit for purpose, in my opinion. Like if you're going to play like a double pivot type thing, unless you say Gramar's going to sit deeper and Tonali has a little more freedom. Balaba, I mean, Brighton just do it again, right? $27 million. Adam Wharton, $21 million. Don't get me wrong. I will be the first one to say I think Adam Wharton is the most overrated player in the Premier League at this point. But he does some things that I think Tonali does. Like he's as irresponsible as Tonali is at times. But the guy's the ultimate line breaker. He's the ultimate progressive passer.
And for a third the price.
For a third the price.
There.
I think the performance is similar. Certainly the ceiling is there too. Again, if I'm a manager, I probably would rather have Tonali if the price doesn't matter. But I think it's also like, God, and if you make a move like that, if you have a little longer term time horizon, and say you get like a Wharton for $21 million, or you pay $25 million to get him, you still got money left over to make a play for like, dude, Angelo Stiller, $5.5 million was available that summer. What's he worth now? 40? Johnny Cardosa, USA, New Jersey born, my friend, $6 million. Alan Varela, who's a no-brainer. If you wanted like a sturdy, I don't know if the Premier League's the best fit for him, but if you wanted a sturdy, you're not getting by me, I will stuff you and break your legs type guy, $8 million. I mean, that's a surefire thing too, because he was a stud in Argentina. Santiago Hesse is another classic. $4 million for him. He's a good player. He could come in. There's a whole lot of guys in there. I'm just saying, I think you got to have some upside if you've got to think about PSR and sustainability and whatnot. And I feel like maybe this one was a little aggressive.
Well, I think also too, Ryan, a point that we haven't really discussed is, their only buys from the championship have been relegated clubs that summer, right? So when you look at what Palace are doing, which I give them a ton of credit for, the Ezes, the Olises, the Whartons, right? Like Newcastle didn't really do that, and they probably could have, to get some of those guys that are just as talented or kind of right on the cusp, and you can probably save some money there in regard to spending those fees. So yeah, but I think all in all, I think Paul Mitchell is spot on in regards to the evaluation of the club, where I think they have to go outside to really get to a place where they're not in the spots that they have been.
I mean, Tonali, I can argue, is a little bit of a unique player, I get. So I don't want to go back on what we said. The lesson to be learned here is if you're going to spend big money on even a young player, make sure you get your number one guy. Maybe this isn't the perfect recruitment. Harvey Barnes, another good example. 44 million euros for him. Again, it's not his fault he's been injured, right? I mean, he's only had 14 starts in a season and a half, only 1,700 league minutes. He's been productive in those times. He was banging them in for Leicester, no question about it. That's a big fee, though. For me, I mean, I look at like Mohamed Kudus went for similar. Iwobi's older, but he went for a lot less. Njai went for 17 million. Like, is he a better player, a worse player? Certainly comparable. I mean, Harvey Barnes is really good, though. I can't say he's not. I think a guy's on loan, too. Fati, Danjuma, Jadon Sancho, Benrahma, maybe not the best examples. But look at where Forest are right now. Hudson-Odoi, $3.5 million.
Yeah.
Elanga, $17.5 million. Higher risk, guys that maybe haven't quite done the job yet, the Premier League to the extent. Noah Long is the perfect example to me. Like that's such a good example. Like I view him as the exact same level as Harvey Barnes performance-wise. $12.5 million. Maybe there's some character issues there. But the point is same functionally type player. You know what I mean? Like, and again, you like him, he's your best deal. But this, I guess the point I'm trying to make is go get your number one choice, spend big money on him, but you can't sustain that forever. Maybe you can if you're United. And that's why, actually, if I'm United in the big club, this is how I would recruit. I don't know why they even bother with some of the nonsense like the Lenny Euros of the world. Like, it was a talented guy, but like, just go get Branthwaite. Like, what are you doing? Because you have the money to sustain that. So if you took that recruitment approach and everyone else did, you're going to beat them every time because you got more money. Newcastle's not quite there yet. Livramento, let's unpack this one a little bit more. So he's only 20 years old. 37.5 million euros. If he's not coming off an ACL tear, maybe that's a lot of money for a right back.
Even
though.
Still,
he's still only 22 now. He can play both fullbacks. I mean, boy, I like Bournemouth deal to get Kirkes for 17 million though in the same window. Left back, not a right back, but I mean, Livramento's playing left back most of the time now.
Right.
Daniel Munoz, 27 years old, $8 million. That's a pretty good value. Like, there's some alternatives here. I just think this is the summer where that recruitment style, well, I don't think it's hurt. I mean, they're performing on the field, so I can't be too critical here. This is the result of it, though. I mean, you've got to accept reality. If you're going to recruit like this is what's going to happen. So what do you do now? And that's the key. Like, I mean, to me, like we'll get to who you've run out and how you go forward, but like this is a little bit head coach influence, right? I mean, it just goes to show you, even in a committee, if you're given the choice between a Kirkes and a Livramento, one guy's been in England, he's shown that he could do it now. Which one's the head coach going to pick? Duh. Maybe one has more risk than the other, but is that the better deal? And again, you can do that. Just recognize what the ramifications are. So surely a head coach can have too much influence, right? Even with a decent strategy conceptually.
Yeah, and I think that could be part of why Mitchell alluded to casting the wider net, because when you have a very head coach driven recruitment strategy, they're not going to want to go off the beaten path too much. They're going to want to recruit from the top leagues, get the top
familiarity.
100%. So if you come to them with a guy they haven't seen play, doesn't play in a league that they're super familiar with, it's going to be a tougher sell. And if you don't have the other people in the room who can wield enough influence to get that over the line, then you get stuck with arguably overpaying for guys in the league or very close adjacent leagues.
So did Newcastle just luck out by hitting such home runs with their first guys? Because we agree that some of those guys, Guimaraes, Gordon, Isak, are big, like that's
huge success.
Peak value, though, right? I mean, you definitely paid a lot at the time for those players, because you look at their spend since summer of 2023. The gross spend is about 260 million euros. They're down 5% from a market value in sales from that. And that also includes, don't get me wrong, it's inflated a little bit because of the PSR moves, but I think the PSR moves makes it look, the return on investment look better, because you've had to sell guys outside of this. So that calculation is basically saying these are the guys that we've spent on, and this is their current market value or sales. So Minte's in that, for example, because we got a huge benefit, or Newcastle got a huge benefit from that. But then the backup keeper's also in it as an overpay, and the Elliot Anderson sale is not, because they didn't buy Elliot Anderson. But that's not a good return on investment necessarily. Don't get me wrong. Tonali's at kind of a low end. Maybe some of these guys, when they come back in, Harvey Barnes has been out a bit. Maybe he recoups value. But I guess, some of this may be head coach influence, but I think the real question to be asked now is, what's your prognosis going forward? So all that's said been above, right? They paid high fees and wages, right? They have some very good young players. They've sold a couple good young ones. And so my problem is they've made very few low-cost, high-upside acquisitions. And they've had very few players coming out of the academy a little bit, like the Minte one. You don't want them to go. So if you look at who's still left out there, like Osula, they made that deal. Maybe that's your buy low, sell high type thing. But here's the problem. So are they stuck now from a PSR standpoint because of that? So they've had to sell Minte. They had to sell Anderson to fuel any sort of investment in the summer. I mean, if you look at all the market values in the guys out there, I mean, do they have to sell Lewis Millie? If you look at all the market value, like what the club is tied into, and just look at all of them, they're all guys they bought. Isak, Guimaraes, Gordon, Botman, Tonali. Joe Linton is the one where he's been repurposed a little bit. Again, he was a very expensive player, though, to begin with. Livramento, Harvey Barnes, Lewis Hall. And sometimes in transfer market, you're inflated because it starts from the base of what you paid for him, right? So I get that. Willock, same type of thing. But if you go down, like none of these guys are guys that they bought low and developed. Sean Longstaff, they're probably going to lose him. Hopefully not to Everton.
Probably to Everton.
Well, look, I'll still take him if he's like free, if it's value. But you start looking, so who could they move? Will they have to sell Isak?
Right.
Would they have to sell Lewis Millie? Like, where do you guys think they go from here? Because they're sitting at like 6th in the table. They've won their trophy, though. They got Europe, 10th in expected point. They're certainly not the club maybe they were. Where do they go from here?
So I think, to your point, Ryan, they have been really fortunate on the players that they've relied on. To your point, repurpose, like Jacob Murphy's another example of a guy that has just given them such good minutes. Even Joe Willock, at the time, terrible overpay, but he's giving them good minutes. Fabian Scher, Callum Wilson's kind of at, they're going to probably lose him for free. So that's just another kind of player, right? So they have a lot of older players in that squad, actually, that are either going to be kind of another year older and they're going to just, rely on, but they're probably going to have to sell one of Bruno or Isak to get to a place where they can get to a strategy of bringing in some of these players. Because to your point, the wages are so high, right? And then, someone like Isak, right? He's sooner or later going to probably demand to leave, right? Similar to Bruno possibly, right? In terms of whether it be to, Real Madrid or whether it be to, let's just say, Man City or somebody like that. So it's kind of one of those situations where I think they have to gauge the contracts as well to figure out like who they think is a higher risk to leave. But I have to think if they're them, especially you look at market values, like what can they do? Or even looking at selling somebody like Harvey Barnes, right? Like they might be able to make 44 million, but if that gets you to a place of 30, 35, right, that still gives you money to play with. So it's just, there's a few different options, but none of them look great.
I think in some ways they are a perfect example of like the end of the line for the type of strategy that they've followed, in that, okay, you have a squad of really good players, but there isn't a lot of opportunity to profit from those players. And so you kind of have to, they'll almost certainly sell Isak. They'll give them a little bit of breathing room, but you need to be able to have that consistent profit margin on players to continue to then reinvest. And what we haven't talked about is the commercial side. They've obviously done tremendously well growing their commercial revenue, so that can provide a little bit of wiggle room from an ability to spend standpoint. But when you pay top dollar and you don't increase in value on most, if not all, talking about Isak, 70 million, he's worth 100 million now. 30 million is a decent profit, but it's not a double, tripling in value that you would hope to see if you're truly investing it in value and upside.
And that's the problem. I mean, you're going to retain the young player for longer and get the performance, but fundamentally, like from a PSR standpoint, it'd be great because he's amortized a little bit now. But
right.
But that's part of the problem. I mean, so if you're going to invest, like I think of like a Minte. He's 18 when you bought him at 8 million. Fantastic, right? I mean, that you got to have some of those in there because that's the nature of PSR and the way it works. I think of like Livramento, 20 years old, right? Young player, but you spent 37 million euros on him. Like, what's the upside there? Like, there's some.
For a left or for an outside back, like who don't typically command giant fees.
Right. Unless he turns into the best fullback on the planet, which maybe he does. I think of Lewis Hall. Lewis Hall has started 24 times this year so far for them in 28 games. And I would argue he's not been amazing. He's been fine. But he's a really young player that you paid 33 million for. And again, that it'll amortize over years, and eventually if you wanted to sell him. This isn't about selling players, too. This is about getting growth and stuff. Like, that may turn out to be a good investment, but the problem is if you need PSR relief immediately and you need to gain some positives from sales, like everyone does, City does, everyone does, you don't have it. Because you went with that. I think maybe they went with the strategy a little bit too long. So if you think about that summer in 23-24, Tonali, Barnes, Livramento, Minta. Like, if you needed a guy that contributed right away and that could really bang him in, okay, maybe Barnes makes sense, but did you need to spend 58, 59 million on Tonali? Is he the guy is he the difference maker immediately? And if he's not, I mean, his upside is 60 million euros. I'm not quite sure I'm seeing that one. I don't know if that's the right move. I think you could have spread that around and built some younger guys in that you could sub in and out. And because I don't think the performance, I mean, Tonali's good, but I don't know. I just feel like they took the strategy was too long. It's just lasted too long, in my opinion. I would argue they overpaid for some other guys too, but it's hard to argue they didn't get the results. But the question is, where do you go now? This was your strategy. You stuck with it. And I think Paul Mitchell would say you probably stuck with it too long and you needed to diversify and be a little smarter.
Well, I think part of it is the desire, once you get that first year of Champions League, you want to sort of cement yourself in that tier of English football and European football. And so you don't want to drop back down. And so they tried to overspend maybe to try to keep the squad level high enough to maintain. But then when you don't get it, you can't guarantee it. And then you take tremendous risks to try to maintain that position. And when you don't get it, then the bottom sort of falls out and the flaws in the strategy are really put on full display.
Well, I think what we found out over the years is if you don't invest every single summer, you're going to fall.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, sometimes you get lucky, but look, it's even City. Like you have to continually invest. So you have to have a strategy, whether it requires sales here or there, to facilitate that constant investment. And I think it's not just about, I guess the message here is it's not just about buying young players too. So I think taking a step back is just kind of looking at it. So far we've taken a deep dive into these guys. We've taken a deep dive into West Ham and Moyes' time there. We've looked pretty hard at Leeds, certainly from a structural standpoint. So I think there's some messages here that would help Everton in terms of going forward and things maybe for us and our listeners to look for as they start to unfold here. So I want to hit you guys with, I think some of the themes are and get your kind of take on it. So one thing we talked about is buying younger players. Like often you out there in the ethosphere and people talking about buy young. It's just about buying young. It's not just about buying young. That's ideal. You can sustain their value and get their performance for longer, but you can't ignore value or else it catches up with you, right? I mean, I think Newcastle is a very good example of this, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think, bringing it back to Everton circles, right? We talk about Ernest Nuama, right? But you start with him at a floor of 20 million, right? And he's going to either probably hit that market value, stay there, or he's going to grow to a 30, $40 million player. And, that's a guy that also probably you see contributing pretty quickly, right? So from a Newcastle standpoint, looking at the wingbacks, right, you put yourself in a tough spot when you spend 30 plus million on two of those guys, and they're not, the most dynamic players, right? They're solid. They're both solid right backs and left backs. So no, agree with you there, Ryan. It's just, I think I want us to buy young players, but at values, right, that we can continue to grow rather than hamper us in the future.
It's those deals like 20, 25 million or less for the young player where, depending on their current ability, you can see them turning into a 30, 40 million player versus buying the guy at close to 50. The likelihood you're going to get 70, 80 is the upside just so low. It's such a high risk.
Well, and the other thing is, too, is if a Premier League club comes knocking on your door, you're going to pay X amount of money. So it's not really fair to say, like, Santiago Hesse's a really good player, but at $4 million. Like, that's not going to happen. They're going to tell you, they're going to give you the Premier League upcharge. But still, I think you got to have a healthy mix of those players. And I think you find them elsewhere. Like, I can't understand how Newcastle, with all that money, wouldn't have looked to South America, wouldn't have looked to the Americas in general. You know what I mean? Like, and I think that's the thing. So look, one thing to be said, though, I think one thing also to be learned is, look, if you're going to go big, you better get it right. If you go big and get it right, I mean, look at the performance Newcastle has had on a core of guys like Isak himself. My God, how many points in the table has that guy worked? And look, you paid big dollar for him, but you nailed it. Because think about how many clubs haven't. You brought up one striker at Manchester United. I mean, just go down the list. Like, Liverpool was data-driven, intelligent recruitment, and granted, those guys had left, but Darwin Nunez has been a disaster for them, and it was a similar situation. And it's not just because center forwards are hard to predict. That's got nothing to do with it. So I think this is one where Everton have to think about that. Like, if you're going to go in and big for a player, like a bunch of rumors out there, but say the challenge is can you get the top players, right? If you're going to go in for him, you better get him right, because you got to force him to join. You got to probably overpay him a little bit to do that. If that ideal player at a better value is not available yet, you may want to wait. And you may want to take a longer-term perspective if your goal is to consistently compete.
And that's where you need that outside influence besides the manager who's going to be singularly focused on winning now. You need someone to say, hey, the Gahey for 70 million, we can't do that. It's just not the right timing. It's too much. We need to be patient and look for a different target.
Right. And so there's a combination of things in there, too. So we mentioned, like, buying younger players is ideal. Can't ignore value, right? Going big is fine. You better get them right. I think the other one is coach-driven recruitment can be problematic in the long run in terms of risk aversion. It can limit targets as well as youth risk return. But I think in combination, it's buying from Big Five leagues. England, in particular, is often very expensive. And so those work together, right? Because there's risk aversion from a coach naturally. You want someone that can come in and immediately contribute. But casting a wider net makes sense because there's more value there, because there's more risk. And that's all that really is. I think that makes sense. And I like the idea that you have to walk away from some deals. And so if you have needs that you have to address immediately, and Everton's got some of these. Now, beneficially, though, there are many players that can improve Everton. It's just to what extent. Like that player that's going to send them over the hump. Well, we're not at the hump yet. That being said, if you can overpay for Ryan Cherokee, I take it. But that's a great example of a guy that probably won't join Everton, for example.
Sure.
He might be available there at a decent value. It'd be nice to be in that position. Do you scupper that deal for overpaying for him? There's a balance there, and you can run out of runway. And I think that's what we've seen in Newcastle, right? I think that's what we've seen in Newcastle. Last thoughts on transfer committees. Like, have we learned anything from the structure here? I mean, certainly there's some conflict from Paul Mitchell, conflict with maybe the way things were done under Dan Ashworth. I thought we said Dan Ashworth is the greatest football executive known to man outside of Ralph Ragnick. So I had to go there. I mean, just had to.
Yeah, I think it's all about, as we talked about in the Kinnear episode, who's on the committee, how are decisions reached? Is it a majority vote? Is it driving consensus across all the groups? Do certain parties have more influence than others? Like, it can get very political very quick. And so you need to have a clear structure with balancing the short term and the long term and making sure that everyone's clear and aligned on the priorities from the get-go and not giving too much influence to any singular person. I think that's really what it comes down to. It's only, as we have here, as good as the people who are on it. So there's no inherent problem with it, but depending on how it's implemented, it can cause problems over time.
So what about this thought? Angus Kinnear in our episode talked all the time about how he liked conflict was good in recruitment to a certain extent. Would he bring in someone like Nick Hammond, do you think, as the cool head to kind of balance out the short-term obsession maybe with managers? It's an interesting thought, right? I mean, I think about, like, for example, the people in the committee matter more than anything. Like, I think about Liverpool, how much better their recruitment got under Klopp rather than a guy like Brendan Rodgers who just wants to control and force everything. Does a Kinnear, Nick Hammond consultant come in, maybe balance out a little bit what Moyes wants, and you end up guys with like Charlie, who's, I think, a very good example of a guy that at 15 million euros, it's 15 million euros, by the way. It's not 15 million pounds. It's not 18 million pounds. Fabrizio is wrong, gentlemen. I'm telling you. I know it's 15 million euros. That's all it is. Like, that's a good deal. You know, you're not going to get much cheaper from a guy that's already played in the Premier League too. That's got upside. He's age appropriate, that you might be able to get some value from, right?
No, I'd agree, Ryan. I mean, because also, too, I think we'll learn as time goes on, especially this summer will be a good telltale to figure out who is on this committee. My hope is that Moyes is the only person, there's no like Alan Irvine, other folks that kind of come in that somehow get invited to this committee, right? We hope it's Angus, Hammond, other kind of influences in terms of our recruitment and scouting team that are a part of it. It'll be interesting to see, because I think even you look at Newcastle's, right, their first window, I actually thought they did a pretty good job of, addressing major needs and I think having a collective collaboration, because I think the one thing I can give a manager levity to is in the short term, right, I get that you need your guys for what the task is, right? For Moyes, unfortunately, or fortunately, he didn't really have that. And Charlie was actually the perfect kind of addition. And now we're in a place where we're very stable, right? So it's good that we didn't make those moves. So yeah, it's a wait and see approach. And my hope is that they put competent people, because we have competent people at the top.
And I think that's a pretty big outstanding question on the committee is, what is Everton's short-term goal balanced against the long-term goal? We know generally what the long-term goal is.
Great question.
How quickly does the Friedkin group view that goal as being achievable? Do they want to take a second-year Newcastle approach and go big for a bunch of guys? Obviously, we don't know the extent of the financials, and will tomorrow. But that's a really interesting point of, like, what strategy are they going to adopt? Will they try to dramatically improve the team by going big early? Will we see a sort of a mixed bag? I imagine we'll see some mixed kind of deals, a mixture of maybe some more experience. Again, we've said it on almost every episode. There's a lot of players that need to be signed, so you're going to have to sort of run the gamut of across the different deal structures, player types. We're not going to recruit all young. We probably won't recruit all old. It'll be a mixture. I'm sure Moyes will find some way to get a couple of guys that he knows very well, who he thinks can contribute quickly, but you got to balance that out with the long-term prognosis.
Yeah, as long as it's ROI based. Like, there's
Right.
value to be made in some guys. Lloyd Kelly's a great example, right, Sean? Like, you brought on a guy that's a really good center back. I mean, he's filled in rather nicely. You got a guy like Sven Botman that can't do it, and maybe he's not played as much as you would expect that he would, because he's very good, because the other guys have stepped up. That's great. But then despite the high wages, you had ability to move him on. And that's okay, So I think there is a little bit of a balance here. So I think thumbs up in general for Newcastle for finding the right guys, right? I think they've turned into a pretty good club. They definitely have some elite players. They paid a lot of money for those elite players. Maybe they went over their skis a little bit in continuing with the strategy that sacrificed a little bit of the long term for the short term. Maybe mixing in some younger buys, some different prospects. Maybe just the academy wasn't producing what they wanted. Maybe they didn't invest in the academy as much. Maybe they haven't seen those returns yet. But maybe a little bit more intelligent investment would have done better. But I think we agree that the most part, whether the investment strategy was perfect or not, the recruitment was pretty darn good. So I don't think they're in that bad a position. You don't want to sell an Alexander Isak necessarily, but you probably might have to for now. And maybe they'll take a step back again, reinvest, and take more of the Paul Mitchell approach, which is a lot easier to do when you got a trophy sitting in the trophy case. And I think that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world necessarily for Everton pursue. And the nice thing is you can change. You can adjust unless you go really, really bad. Again, if those guys hadn't panned out, that'd be a very different situation here. But they did, so kudos for them for getting the recruitment right. And I think it's fantastic that they won the League Cup. So parade on, my friends.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot to dissect from an Everton standpoint, and I think it's really interesting to see where Everton do similar things to some of these other clubs that we're also going to talk about in the future, but also specifically Newcastle. It's just a big blank slate that I'm really interested to see how it all unfolds, and frankly excited because it feels like the right pieces are starting to be put into place. Maybe not as quickly as I'd like. It still feels like there's so much that's unknown, and the summer is really coming up quick.
I'd love to hear from our listeners, too, if there are particular clubs they want us to kind of break down in a similar way. I mean, I think it's some are obvious, like Forest went crazy. That was a very unique approach, and they're reaping the success. We're going to take a look at them. Kinnear mentioned how Brighton did something similar to Newcastle did. I don't know if I really believe that. Brighton is a very obvious one to take apart, right? I mean, everyone kind of reveres them as being the gold standard for recruitment. But if there are other clubs that people want us to really take a look at, I think we're happy to do that. And I hope some other people listen to this episode as well, even outside the Everton sphere. I think it's an interesting take, and I would love to give some of the Newcastle guys, I would love to have their takes on this stuff as well. Did we get it right? How do they feel? Because that's really ultimately what matters, the supporters. I just hope that they think not just how I feel now, but how I'm going to feel in the future as well.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, would love candid feedback from our listenership on, if you like kind of the content and just the overall depth of these episodes. I think this is something, to Ryan's point, we really want to take a deep dive into, not only for Everton purposes, but just, I think, the collective whole of seeing, different clubs and especially, too, the similarities and trying to learn from those mistakes. And we hope our ownership, right, is doing the same. So
I think that's a good place to wrap up this episode. Again, please reach out with feedback. We appreciate everyone checking this out and hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, leave us a rating and review on your podcast platform of choice. We appreciate that. Follow us on socials. Join our Discord 100%. We'll be putting some visuals from the episode in the Discord for further discussion. So hope to see you there. Otherwise, we've got the Derby on Wednesday. Looking forward to that. A big match. And we'll be coming to you with a post-match following that one. So until then, until next time, up the Toffees.
This bracket season, FanDuel is letting you make the call. Because right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 extra bucks to bet on everything from clutch shots to last-second heartbreaks, and even who's cutting down the nets. If you've been waiting to join, there's no better time. There's tourney action almost every day, and FanDuel has amazing bet types like spreads, totals, game props, and so much more. So visit FanDuel.com/betbig and get in on the college hoops action all tourney long. National. Must be 21 plus and present in select states or 18 plus and present in D.C. First online real money wager only. $5 first deposit required. Bonus issued as non-withdrawable bonus bets, which expire 7 days after receipt. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. FanDuel is offering online sports wagering in Kansas under an agreement with Kansas Star Casino, LLC. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit fanduel.com/RG. Call 1-888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org/chat in Connecticut or visit mdgamblinghelp.org in Maryland. Hope is here. Visit gamblinghelplinema.org or call 800-327-5050 for 24/7 support in Massachusetts or call 1-877.
It's true that some things change as we get older. But if you're a woman over 40 and you're dealing with insomnia, brain fog, moodiness, and weight gain, you don't have to accept it as just another part of aging. And with MIDI Health, you can get help and stop pushing through it alone. The experts at MIDI understand that all these symptoms can be connected to the hormonal changes that happen around menopause, and MIDI can help you feel more like yourself again. Many healthcare providers aren't trained to treat or even recognize menopause symptoms. MIDI clinicians are menopause experts. They're dedicated to providing safe, effective, FDA-approved solutions for dozens of hormonal symptoms, not just hot flashes. Most importantly, they're covered by insurance. 91% of MIDI patients get relief from symptoms within just 2 months. You deserve to feel great. Book your virtual visit today at joinmidi.com. That's joinmidi.com.